Picture this. A man born into chains becomes the architect of an empire's downfall, a figure so powerful that Napoleon Bonaparte himself trembles at the mention of his name. This is not fiction. This is not legend. This is the extraordinary true story of how one enslaved man rose from the sugar plantations of the Caribbean to become the single greatest threat the French Empire had ever faced. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about the age of Napoleon. While history books celebrate European generals and their grand campaigns, they conveniently forget the brilliant strategist who outmaneuvered three of the world's most powerful nations simultaneously. They ignore the tactical genius who transformed illiterate field workers into an unstoppable military force. They erase the revolutionary who achieved what no other enslaved person in history had ever accomplished. Today, we uncover the buried truth about Toussaint Louverture, the man whose very existence challenged the foundations of European civilization. This is the story they never wanted you to hear, because acknowledging it means admitting that the greatest military mind of the 18th century was not European at all. But before we dive into this incredible journey, hit that like button right now, because by the end of this video, you'll understand why this forgotten hero deserves to be remembered alongside the greatest leaders in human history. Our story begins in 1743 on the island of Saint-Domingue, known today as Haiti. This Caribbean paradise was anything but paradise for the 500,000 souls trapped in bondage there. The French colony produced unimaginable wealth through sugar, coffee, and indigo plantations, generating more revenue than all 13 American colonies combined. But this prosperity came at an unspeakable cost: the systematic brutalization of human beings on an industrial scale. Into this hell was born a child who would grow up to reshape the entire Atlantic world. François-Dominique Toussaint entered existence as property. His birth recorded not in family records, but in plantation ledgers alongside livestock and farming equipment. The circumstances of his early life remain shrouded in competing narratives. Some accounts claim his father was an African prince, captured and sold into slavery. Others describe more humble origins among the plantation workforce. The truth matters less than what Toussaint would make of himself despite these beginnings. Fortune smiled upon the young Toussaint in one crucial way. He avoided the killing fields of the sugar plantations. Instead of cutting cane under the merciless Caribbean sun, he was assigned as a coachman to his master. This seemingly small distinction carried enormous consequences. While field slaves died within 7 years of arrival, domestic workers could survive decades. While plantation laborers remained illiterate by design, household slaves sometimes gained access to books and education. Toussaint seized this opportunity with remarkable determination. In secret, he learned to read French and Latin. He devoured every book he could find, from philosophical treatises to military histories. The campaigns of Julius Caesar fascinated him particularly, and he studied the tactics that had conquered Gaul with the intensity of a professional soldier. His master, recognizing Toussaint's exceptional intelligence, eventually allowed him to manage plantation affairs. To outside observers, this arrangement appeared to benefit everyone involved. The master gained an efficient administrator, and Toussaint enjoyed privileges denied to other slaves. But beneath this facade of contentment, something far more significant was developing. Toussaint was not simply adapting to his circumstances, he was preparing for something greater. Every conversation with his master revealed details about colonial governance. Every trip to neighboring plantations provided intelligence about the island's defenses. Every interaction with fellow slaves allowed him to identify potential leaders and assess their readiness for action. The young coachman understood something that escaped both masters and slaves. Knowledge was the ultimate weapon. While others focused on immediate survival, Toussaint was building a comprehensive understanding of the system that oppressed them. He memorized the locations of weapons stores, studied the schedules of military patrols, and carefully noted which overseers could be bribed or intimidated. Most importantly, he began identifying slaves who possessed natural leadership abilities and slowly began cultivating relationships with them. By the 1780s, Toussaint had transformed himself into something unprecedented in the colonial world, an enslaved person who understood both the mechanisms of oppression and the potential pathways to freedom. His reputation among both slaves and masters was impeccable. He was known as intelligent, loyal, and completely trustworthy. This carefully crafted persona served as perfect camouflage for his true activities. During these years, Toussaint was secretly building what would later become the foundation of revolution. He established communication networks between plantations, identified potential weapons caches, and began the delicate work of political education among his fellow slaves. But he was careful never to reveal his ultimate intentions. To masters, he remained the model slave. To fellow bondsmen, he appeared as a helpful intermediary who could navigate the dangerous waters between slave quarters and master's house. The transformation of Toussaint from coachman to revolutionary leader did not happen overnight. It required years of patient preparation, careful observation, and strategic thinking. While other slaves dreamed of escape to the mountains or quick strikes against hated overseers, Toussaint was envisioning something far more ambitious: the complete overthrow of the colonial system itself. This vision required an understanding not just of local conditions, but of the broader political currents shaping the Atlantic world. Toussaint closely followed news from Europe, where revolutionary ideas were challenging traditional authority. The American Revolution had demonstrated that colonial subjects could successfully resist European powers. The French Revolution was proclaiming the rights of man and citizen, though these rights conspicuously excluded the enslaved populations that generated so much of France's wealth. These contradictions were not lost on Toussaint. If all men were created equal, as revolutionary proclamations insisted, then what justified the continued enslavement of Africans? If legitimate government required the consent of the governed, then what legitimacy could colonial rule possess? These questions would soon find their answers not in philosophical debates, but on the battlefields of Saint-Domingue. As the 1780s progressed into the 1790s, the contradictions within French colonial society became increasingly unstable. The white planters, who had grown wealthy from slave labor, found themselves caught between their desire for autonomy and their dependence on French military protection. The free people of color, many of whom owned slaves themselves, demanded equality with whites while maintaining their own privileged position above the enslaved masses. And throughout it all, the 500,000 enslaved Africans continued their backbreaking labor, watching and waiting for an opportunity that seemed destined never to come. But Toussaint knew better. He could sense the growing tensions within colonial society, could see how competing interests were pulling the colony in different directions. He understood that crisis creates opportunity, and he was methodically preparing himself and his allies for the moment when that opportunity would present itself. The careful coachman who had spent decades earning trust and gathering intelligence was about to become something the world had never seen: a slave who would challenge empires and emerge victorious. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape not just Saint-Domingue, but the entire Atlantic world. European powers would discover that their most valuable colony harbored the seeds of their greatest nightmare. And at the center of it all stood a man who had transformed himself from property into the architect of revolution, ready to prove that the desire for freedom could overcome any obstacle, no matter how insurmountable it might appear. The powder keg that was Saint-Domingue finally exploded on August 22nd, 1791, in a ceremony that would echo through history. Deep in the forests of Bois Caïman, hundreds of enslaved Africans gathered under cover of darkness for what appeared to be a religious ritual. But this was no ordinary ceremony. The air crackled with revolutionary energy as Boukman Dutty, a towering figure who served as both priest and military leader, administered blood oaths to the assembled conspirators. Thunder rolled overhead as if nature itself was bearing witness to the momentous decision being made. The signal was simple, yet devastating. Simultaneous uprisings across the northern plantations. What followed was the largest slave rebellion in human history, a coordinated explosion of rage that had been building for generations. Within hours, the night sky blazed with the flames of burning plantation houses. The sound of breaking chains mixed with the screams of fleeing overseers and the war cries of newly liberated slaves. A century of accumulated brutality was being repaid in a single night of fire and blood. Yet conspicuously absent from the initial leadership was the one man who had been preparing for this moment longer than anyone else. While other slaves rushed to join the spontaneous uprising, Toussaint remained at his post, playing the role of the loyal coachman even as revolution erupted around him. To those who knew him, this restraint seemed almost cowardly, but Toussaint understood something the other rebels did not. Raw fury, no matter how justified, could not sustain a revolution against the most powerful military forces in the world. As plantation after plantation fell to the rebels, European observers watched in horror as their carefully constructed racial hierarchy collapsed overnight. The rebels showed no mercy to those who had shown them none. Overseers who had wielded whips with sadistic pleasure found themselves facing the business end of machetes. Plantation owners who had treated human beings as livestock discovered what it felt like to be hunted like animals. The violence was shocking in its intensity, but it paled in comparison to the centuries of systematic brutality that had preceded it. The initial rebel leaders were men of courage and passion, but they lacked the strategic vision necessary for sustained warfare. Boukman Dutty possessed incredible charisma and religious authority, but his military thinking remained rooted in guerrilla raids and symbolic victories. Jean-François and Biassou, other early commanders, understood the importance of maintaining momentum, but they had no clear plan for what would come after the plantations burned. Their revolution was fueled by righteous anger, but anger alone could not defeat professional armies equipped with artillery and cavalry. This is precisely where Toussaint's years of patient preparation proved invaluable. While other leaders celebrated each tactical victory, he was analyzing the broader strategic situation with the cold calculation of a chess master. The rebels controlled the countryside, but the colonial authorities still held the fortified cities and the crucial ports. European reinforcements would inevitably arrive, bringing with them the kind of disciplined military force that could crush disorganized insurgents. Most critically, the rebellion lacked political legitimacy in the eyes of the broader world, making it vulnerable to isolation and eventual strangulation. Toussaint emerged from the shadows gradually, offering his services first as an advisor, then as a subordinate commander, and finally as an independent leader with his own following. His reputation for literacy and intelligence preceded him, but what truly set him apart was his systematic approach to military organization. While other rebel bands remained loose collections of armed slaves, Toussaint began implementing the kind of military discipline he had learned from studying European warfare. The transformation was remarkable to witness. Men who had spent their lives hunched over sugarcane learned to march in formation and execute complex battlefield maneuvers. Former field hands who had never held anything more dangerous than farming tools became skilled marksmen and cavalry riders. Toussaint divided his forces into specialized units, established clear chains of command, and instituted harsh punishments for desertion or cowardice. Most importantly, he began recruiting Europeans who were willing to serve the revolution in exchange for their lives and freedom. But military organization was only part of Toussaint's genius. He understood that the rebellion could not survive in isolation, and he began the delicate work of international diplomacy that would prove crucial to his ultimate success. The Caribbean had become a complex chessboard where multiple European powers competed for advantage. Spain controlled the eastern portion of the island. Britain dominated the seas with its powerful navy, and France struggled to maintain control over its most valuable colony while simultaneously fighting wars across Europe. Toussaint saw opportunity in this chaos. Rather than viewing the European powers as uniform enemies, he recognized that their conflicting interests could be exploited to the rebellion's advantage. This required a level of political sophistication that no enslaved person had ever demonstrated before. Toussaint would need to negotiate with Spanish governors, British admirals, and French commissioners as an equal, despite having been born into bondage on the very island where these negotiations would take place. The first test of this diplomatic strategy came when Spanish agents approached the rebel leaders with an intriguing proposition. Spain had been watching the Saint-Domingue uprising with great interest. Seeing an opportunity to weaken their French rivals, they offered weapons, training, and military advisors to any rebel leader willing to fight under the Spanish flag. For most of the rebel commanders, this was an easy decision. Spain offered concrete assistance against their immediate enemies, while abstract concepts like independence seemed impossibly distant. Toussaint accepted the Spanish alliance, but with characteristic calculation. He understood that this partnership was temporary, a means to an end rather than a permanent alignment. While fighting for Spain, he would gain access to European military technology and training. His men would learn to use artillery, master cavalry tactics, and understand the logistics of sustained warfare. Most importantly, the alliance would provide breathing space to consolidate rebel control over the countryside and build the kind of disciplined army necessary for eventual independence. The results exceeded even Toussaint's expectations. Under Spanish patronage, his forces began achieving victories that stunned both allies and enemies. French colonial troops who had expected to face disorganized slave bands instead encountered disciplined soldiers who fought with European tactics, but with the desperate courage of men fighting for their freedom. Town after town fell to Toussaint's advancing army as French authority crumbled across the northern regions of the colony. Yet even as military victories accumulated, Toussaint never lost sight of his ultimate objective. The Spanish alliance was useful, but Spain had no intention of genuinely liberating the enslaved population of Saint-Domingue. Spanish officials spoke privately of eventually re-establishing slavery under Spanish rule, with perhaps slightly better treatment for the formerly enslaved population. This was unacceptable to Toussaint, who had not spent decades preparing for revolution, simply to exchange French masters for Spanish ones. The political landscape shifted dramatically in 1794, when revolutionary France took a step that shocked the entire Atlantic world. Under pressure from radical abolitionists and desperate to maintain some control over their rebellious colony, the French National Convention voted to abolish slavery throughout the French Empire. This proclamation created an entirely new set of possibilities and dangers for Toussaint and his followers. The French abolition decree struck like lightning across the colonial world, transforming the very foundations of the conflict overnight. Here was an opportunity that Toussaint had been positioning himself to exploit for years. While his Spanish allies recoiled in horror at the prospect of universal emancipation, Toussaint saw the chance to legitimize his revolution under the banner of French law itself. The man who had spent decades studying European politics understood that this moment demanded another calculated betrayal, one that would shock his allies and cement his reputation as the most cunning strategist of his generation. Without warning or consultation, Toussaint abandoned his Spanish patrons and declared his allegiance to revolutionary France. The speed of this transformation left Spanish commanders stunned and furious. They had armed and trained what they believed was a useful proxy force, only to discover they had created their own nemesis. The weapons they had provided, the military tactics they had taught, the strategic positions they had helped secure, all now turned against them with devastating effectiveness. Spanish forces that had grown comfortable operating alongside Toussaint's troops suddenly found themselves facing an enemy who knew their every weakness. The rebel leader, who had once fought beside them, now systematically dismantled their defensive positions with intimate knowledge of Spanish capabilities and intentions. Within months, Toussaint had not only expelled Spanish forces from territories they had held for years, but had pushed them back across the entire island, recovering every inch of ground they had gained since the rebellion began. This stunning reversal established Toussaint's reputation as a master of political warfare. European observers began to realize they were dealing with someone far more dangerous than a simple rebel leader. Here was a figure who could manipulate international politics with the same skill he brought to battlefield tactics. The implications were terrifying for colonial powers across the Caribbean, because Toussaint had demonstrated that enslaved populations could produce leaders capable of outmaneuvering European diplomats at their own game. But the Spanish defeat was merely a prelude to an even greater challenge. Great Britain, the dominant naval power of the age, had been watching the Saint-Domingue crisis with predatory interest. British strategists saw an opportunity to seize France's most valuable colony. While their rivals were distracted by revolutionary chaos in Europe, they deployed a massive expeditionary force to the Caribbean, confident that disciplined British troops could easily crush whatever remained of the slave rebellion and establish permanent British control over the island's sugar wealth. The British expedition represented everything that had made their empire the most powerful force on Earth. Veteran regiments fresh from campaigns in India brought with them the experience of conquering vast territories populated by supposedly inferior peoples. Naval supremacy ensured steady supply lines and prevented enemy reinforcements from reaching the theatre of operations. Most importantly, British commanders possessed absolute confidence in their racial and cultural superiority over any force that formerly enslaved Africans could possibly assemble. This confidence proved to be their fatal weakness. British generals planned their campaign as if they were facing a conventional European opponent, focusing on capturing key ports and establishing secure supply bases from which to project power inland. They anticipated brief, decisive engagements that would demonstrate British superiority and convince the rebel population to submit to new masters who might prove more benevolent than their French predecessors. Toussaint had no intention of accommodating these expectations. Years of studying military history had taught him that conventional warfare favored the side with superior resources and equipment, advantages that would always belong to European powers operating in the Caribbean. But he had also learned that unconventional tactics could neutralize these advantages, particularly when employed by fighters defending their homeland against foreign invaders who were vulnerable to tropical diseases and unfamiliar terrain. The British discovered that controlling ports meant nothing when the interior remained hostile territory. Every march inland became a nightmare of ambushes and harassment. Supply convoys disappeared into the jungle, their guards found days later with their throats cut and their weapons missing. Isolated garrisons woke to find themselves surrounded by enemies who melted away before reinforcements could arrive, only to reappear elsewhere with deadly persistence. British medical officers recorded horrifying casualty rates that had nothing to do with combat. Yellow fever swept through their ranks with merciless efficiency, killing seasoned soldiers faster than rebel bullets ever could. Men who had survived campaigns across multiple continents succumbed to tropical diseases within weeks of landing in Saint-Domingue. Hospital ships became floating morgues as British commanders watched their carefully assembled force dissolve before their eyes. Toussaint understood that time was his greatest weapon against the British. While his forces remained relatively healthy in their native climate, every day that passed saw British strength diminish through disease and exhaustion. Rather than risk his army in costly frontal assaults, he bled the invaders slowly through constant pressure and strategic withdrawals that drew them deeper into hostile territory where fever and guerrilla attacks could do their work. The psychological impact of this strategy proved as devastating as the physical toll. British soldiers who had expected to face disorganized slave bands instead confronted disciplined units that fought with European tactics, but possessed intimate knowledge of local conditions. These were not the primitive opponents that imperial propaganda had prepared them to encounter. These were skilled warriors, led by commanders who understood both European military science and the unique advantages of their Caribbean environment. General Maitland, the British commander, found himself in an impossible position. His superiors in London demanded decisive action to secure British control over the island, but every offensive operation resulted in catastrophic losses that brought him no closer to victory. The economic costs of the expedition mounted daily as reinforcements died faster than they could be replaced, and supply ships returned to Britain carrying more corpses than cargo. The breaking point came when Toussaint demonstrated his mastery of conventional warfare alongside his guerrilla expertise. In a series of carefully planned engagements, his forces proved capable of defeating British troops in open battle when circumstances favoured the defenders. These victories shattered the myth of European invincibility that had sustained imperial confidence for generations. Word spread throughout the Caribbean that white soldiers could be beaten by black ones. That European military superiority was not an immutable law of nature. Faced with military catastrophe and mounting political pressure from London, Maitland took the unprecedented step of opening direct negotiations with Toussaint as an equal. The sight of a British general treating a former slave as a legitimate head of state sent shockwaves throughout the colonial world. Here was visible proof that the racial hierarchies that justified European dominance were not divinely ordained, but could be challenged and overturned by determined resistance. The British withdrawal from Saint-Domingue marked more than a military defeat. It represented a fundamental shift in Caribbean power dynamics. European observers began to understand that the age of easy colonial conquest was ending. Indigenous and enslaved populations had produced leaders capable of matching European sophistication in both warfare and diplomacy. The comfortable assumption that technological and organizational superiority guaranteed imperial success had been shattered by a man who had transformed himself from plantation property into a force capable of humbling the world's greatest powers. With both Spanish and British forces expelled from French Saint-Domingue, Toussaint stood at the pinnacle of his influence. He commanded an army that had proven itself against European professionals, controlled territory that produced enormous wealth, and enjoyed recognition as a legitimate political leader from powers that had previously denied his very humanity. But these achievements also made him a target for the one European leader who could never tolerate such a challenge to imperial authority. Across the Atlantic, Napoleon Bonaparte was consolidating his grip on power in France with the same ruthless efficiency that had made him master of Europe. The first consul had built his reputation on the promise that French arms could triumph over any opponent, that revolutionary France could export its values through conquest and diplomation. The continued independence of Saint-Domingue under black leadership represented an intolerable contradiction to this imperial vision. For Napoleon, Toussaint's success was more than a political problem. It was a personal affront that struck at the core of his identity as the supreme military genius of his age. Here was a former slave who had achieved victories that rivaled Napoleon's own triumphs, who had outmaneuvered European powers with the same strategic brilliance that had made the French emperor famous. This could not be tolerated, and Napoleon began planning the largest military expedition ever sent to the New World. The stage was set for a final confrontation between two of history's most remarkable leaders. On one side stood Napoleon, master of Europe and architect of empire, backed by the resources of the most powerful military machine on earth. On the other stood Toussaint, the enslaved man who had transformed himself into the liberator of 500,000 souls, defending gains that had been purchased with decades of blood and sacrifice. The outcome of their struggle would determine not just the fate of Saint-Domingue, but the future of slavery and freedom throughout the Atlantic world. Napoleon's response to Toussaint's audacious independence came swift and merciless. In the winter of 1801, the French emperor assembled the largest naval expedition ever launched toward the Americas, 43,000 veteran soldiers, men who had marched across Egypt and conquered Austria, now found themselves bound for a Caribbean island to restore what Napoleon considered the natural order of things. These were not ordinary troops, but the elite of French military might, commanded by General Charles Leclerc, Napoleon's own brother-in-law and one of his most trusted lieutenants. The scale of this armament revealed the depths of Napoleon's fury. He was not simply sending a punitive expedition to reclaim a rebellious colony. This was a statement of imperial will, a demonstration that no former slave, regardless of military genius, could challenge French authority and survive. The emperor's orders to Leclerc were explicit in their brutality: restore slavery, execute the rebel leaders, and ensure that Saint-Domingue served as an example to any other colonial population that might harbour dreams of freedom. But Napoleon had fundamentally misunderstood both his opponent and the nature of the conflict he was initiating. While the French emperor viewed this as a police action against unruly colonial subjects, Toussaint recognized it as an existential struggle between two incompatible visions of human society. The man who had spent decades studying European military tactics was about to face his ultimate test against the most formidable army of his age. The French fleet appeared off the coast of Saint-Domingue in February 1802, its massive sails darkening the horizon like storm clouds. From the decks of his flagship, Leclerc surveyed what he expected would be a brief and decisive campaign. Intelligence reports suggested that many of Toussaint's subordinates were wavering in their loyalty, intimidated by the overwhelming force now arrayed against them. The French general anticipated that a show of strength would be sufficient to collapse rebel resistance and restore colonial order without extensive bloodshed. These calculations proved catastrophically wrong from the very first engagement. Rather than await the French landing, Toussaint implemented a strategy that shocked European observers with its ruthless pragmatism. As French troops approached the port of Le Cap, the most important city in northern Saint-Domingue, they discovered that Toussaint had ordered it burned to the ground. The magnificent colonial capital, built with slave labor over generations, became a blazing inferno that lit the Caribbean sky for 3 days and nights. This scorched earth policy represented more than military tactics. It was a declaration that Toussaint would rather rule over ashes than submit to renewed bondage. The message to his followers was unmistakable. There could be no compromise with the French, no negotiated settlement that preserved their freedom while maintaining colonial control. They would fight to the death or win complete independence. There would be no middle ground. The destruction of Le Cap demonstrated the evolution of Toussaint's strategic thinking since his early days as a rebel leader. Where once he had sought to preserve colonial infrastructure that might serve a future black government, he now understood that material wealth meant nothing if it came at the cost of human freedom. The sugar refineries, the merchant houses, the elegant mansions built with slave labor, all of it could burn if necessary to preserve the revolution's achievements. French forces found themselves occupying smoking ruins instead of intact cities, denied the administrative centers they needed to project power across the island. More significantly, the burning of Le Cap served notice that this would not be a conventional colonial war where European forces could rely on established patterns of domination and submission. Toussaint was rewriting the rules of engagement in ways that neutralized many traditional European advantages. The psychological impact of this destruction extended far beyond its immediate military consequences. French soldiers who had expected to garrison comfortable colonial cities instead found themselves camping in charred wastelands while hostile forces controlled the surrounding countryside. The comfortable assumptions about civilized warfare that had guided European military thinking began to crumble in the face of opponents who refused to accept defeat according to conventional terms. General Leclerc responded to these challenges with escalating brutality that revealed the true nature of French intentions. Captured rebels faced mass executions designed not merely to eliminate resistance, but to terrorize the population into submission. French troops implemented systematic policies of rape and murder, that exceeded even the routine violence of slavery in their calculated cruelty. Entire villages suspected of supporting the rebellion were destroyed, their inhabitants killed regardless of age or gender. These atrocities backfired spectacularly by confirming everything Toussaint had warned about French intentions. Any wavering supporters who might have been tempted to negotiate with Leclerc now understood that surrender meant not just the restoration of slavery, but the physical extermination of everyone who had dared to claim freedom. The French campaign of terror united the black population behind their revolutionary leaders in ways that military defeats could never have accomplished. Toussaint's defensive strategy during this period showcased the military genius that had made him legendary throughout the Caribbean. Rather than risk his army in set-piece battles where French firepower would prove decisive, he implemented a campaign of strategic withdrawal that drew enemy forces deeper into hostile territory, while preserving his own strength for decisive moments. French columns found themselves marching through seemingly empty countryside, only to face devastating ambushes when they least expected attack. The climate itself became Toussaint's ally in ways that European commanders had failed to anticipate. Yellow fever and malaria swept through French ranks with the same merciless efficiency that had destroyed previous European expeditions. Medical officers watched helplessly as veteran soldiers who had survived campaigns across multiple continents succumbed to tropical diseases within weeks of landing. Hospital ships became floating morgues as the Caribbean sun claimed more French lives than rebel bullets ever could. But perhaps most devastating to French morale was the realization that they were fighting enemies who possessed equal or superior military skills while enjoying the support of the local population. French intelligence networks, dependent on colonial collaborators who had fled or been eliminated, provided little useful information about rebel movements. Every civilian encounter carried the risk of assassination or betrayal. The comfortable racial hierarchies that had sustained European confidence began to dissolve under the pressure of military reality. As months passed and French casualties mounted, cracks began appearing in the coalition that supported Leclerc's campaign. Several of Toussaint's subordinate commanders, intimidated by the scale of French military commitment, opened secret negotiations with enemy representatives. These defections created dangerous gaps in rebel lines and provided French forces with crucial intelligence about defensive positions and planned operations. The most significant of these betrayals came from Henri Christophe, one of Toussaint's most trusted lieutenants and the commander of crucial northern territories. Christophe's surrender to French forces created a cascade of additional defections as other commanders calculated that resistance had become hopeless. Within weeks, much of the military structure that Toussaint had spent years building began collapsing as fear overcame revolutionary commitment. Faced with the disintegration of his army and mounting pressure from remaining loyalists to negotiate while some bargaining position remained, Toussaint made the fateful decision that would ultimately seal his doom. In May 1802, he agreed to lay down arms in exchange for French guarantees of personal safety and the promise that his followers would be integrated into colonial society as free citizens, rather than return to slavery. The surrender ceremony itself carried profound symbolic weight that extended far beyond the immediate military situation. Here was the man who had humbled 3 European empires, who had transformed enslaved Africans into disciplined soldiers, who had negotiated as an equal with British generals and Spanish governors, now submitting his sword to French authority. For colonial powers throughout the Atlantic world, this moment represented the restoration of proper racial order after years of dangerous upheaval. But Toussaint's decision to surrender revealed more than military pragmatism. It exposed a fatal flaw in his understanding of European imperial thinking. The revolutionary leader who had mastered the arts of warfare and diplomacy had never fully grasped the extent to which his very existence threatened the psychological foundations of colonial rule. European powers could not allow him to live in peaceful retirement because his survival would serve as permanent proof that racial hierarchies were artificial constructs rather than natural law. For exactly 1 month, Toussaint lived quietly on his former plantation under French surveillance, apparently content to tend his gardens and enjoy the domestic life that decades of warfare had denied him. French officials assured him that his cooperation had earned him the right to peaceful retirement as a private citizen. These promises were lies designed to lull him into the complacency that would make his final capture possible. The trap closed with characteristic French precision on the night of June 7th. Soldiers surrounded Toussaint's residence under cover of darkness, ostensibly to escort him to a meeting with General Leclerc regarding administrative matters. Despite warnings from his family that this was obviously a trap, Toussaint agreed to accompany the soldiers. Whether this decision reflected misplaced trust in French honor or simple resignation to an inevitable fate remains unclear. What followed was the swift and secret removal of the most dangerous man in the Atlantic world. Within 72 hours, Toussaint found himself chained in the hold of a ship bound for France, watching the Caribbean sun disappear behind him for the final time. The man who had built an empire from the ashes of slavery was now a prisoner destined for the coldest dungeon Napoleon could provide. The speed and secrecy of this operation revealed Napoleon's understanding that Toussaint's capture was only the beginning of the challenge he posed to imperial authority. As long as the revolutionary leader remained alive, he would serve as a symbol of successful resistance to European domination. His very existence would inspire other colonial populations to believe that freedom was possible, that European military superiority was not absolute, that racial hierarchies could be challenged and overturned. The fortress of Joux, high in the French Alps, awaited its most famous prisoner. Here, in a stone cell where the temperature never rose above freezing, Napoleon intended to accomplish what armies had failed to achieve: the destruction of Toussaint Louverture. But even in chains, even facing certain death, the former slave who had shaken empires was about to deliver his most devastating blow against the forces that had enslaved his people. The cold mountain air of the Jura region cut through stone walls like a blade, carrying with it the promise of slow death. Fort de Joux stood as a monument to French engineering and imperial cruelty, its massive walls designed to hold the most dangerous enemies of the state. But never before had these ancient stones contained a prisoner whose very existence threatened the foundations of an entire economic system. Toussaint Louverture, the man who had commanded armies and negotiated with emperors, now found himself reduced to a number in a ledger, confined to a cell barely large enough for a single man to lie down. The conditions of his imprisonment were meticulously designed to break both body and spirit. Napoleon's orders were explicit: total isolation, minimal rations, no communication with the outside world. The emperor understood that martyrdom could be as dangerous as living resistance, so Toussaint's death would need to appear natural, the inevitable result of age and confinement rather than deliberate execution. This calculated cruelty revealed the depths of Napoleon's fear. Even chained and helpless, Toussaint remained too dangerous to be treated as an ordinary prisoner. The physical transformation was swift and merciless. A man accustomed to the tropical warmth of the Caribbean found himself trapped in perpetual winter. His breath formed clouds in the frigid air as temperatures dropped well below freezing for months at a time. The meager fire permitted in his cell provided barely enough warmth to prevent immediate death from exposure, but offered no real comfort against the bone-deep cold that penetrated every stone of his prison. Food became another weapon in Napoleon's arsenal of slow destruction. Toussaint received portions calculated to maintain life while steadily weakening his constitution. Hard bread, watery soup, and occasional scraps of meat provided just enough nutrition to prevent starvation while ensuring constant hunger. Guards noted with clinical detachment how the prisoner's robust frame gradually wasted away, his military bearings slowly giving way to the shuffling gait of chronic malnutrition. But the psychological warfare proved even more devastating than physical deprivation. Toussaint had spent his entire adult life surrounded by followers who looked to him for guidance and inspiration. He had grown accustomed to the constant activity of command, the endless stream of decisions that shaped the destiny of hundreds of thousands of people. Now he faced the crushing weight of absolute silence, with no knowledge of whether his revolution had survived his capture or collapsed into renewed slavery. The isolation was methodically enforced through a regime of studied indifference from his captors. Guards who delivered his meager rations were forbidden from speaking to him or acknowledging his attempts at conversation. Mail that might have provided news from Saint-Domingue was intercepted and destroyed before reaching his cell. Even religious consolation was denied, as prison officials refused to provide access to chaplains who might carry word of his condition to the outside world. During the endless hours of solitude, Toussaint's mind turned repeatedly to the question that tormented him most. Had his surrender preserved the freedom he had fought so hard to achieve, or had he merely delayed the inevitable return to bondage? The uncertainty gnawed at him with greater persistence than hunger or cold. A man who had built his identity around protecting his people now faced the possibility that his capture had doomed them to renewed enslavement. French intelligence reports from Saint-Domingue were carefully kept from their prisoner, but they would have provided cold comfort in any case. General Leclerc had moved quickly to implement Napoleon's true agenda following Toussaint's capture. The promises of freedom and equality that had induced several rebel commanders to surrender proved to be elaborate deceptions. French forces began systematically disarming black troops, ostensibly for reorganization, but actually as preparation for their destruction. The mask finally fell away completely when news arrived from other French colonies where slavery had been officially restored. Guadeloupe, where free people of color had believed French promises of permanent emancipation, saw thousands of former slaves rounded up and returned to plantations under even harsher conditions than before. The message was unmistakable. Napoleon intended to turn back the clock on every gain the revolution had achieved. This revelation triggered a response that surpassed even Toussaint's most optimistic projections about his people's commitment to freedom. Jean-Jacques Dessalines, the subordinate commander who had remained loyal when others wavered, emerged from hiding to proclaim a war of extermination against French rule. Unlike Toussaint, who had maintained diplomatic niceties even while fighting for independence, Dessalines embraced a strategy of total warfare that acknowledged no distinction between combatants and civilians. The fury unleashed by this betrayal exceeded anything the Caribbean had witnessed during the previous decade of revolutionary warfare. Dessalines issued proclamations declaring that mercy was a luxury the oppressed could no longer afford. French colonists who had returned expecting to reclaim their plantations found themselves facing opponents who fought with the desperate courage of people who understood that defeat meant not just death, but the eternal enslavement of their children and grandchildren. Military engagements became exercises in mutual annihilation as both sides abandoned any pretense of civilized warfare. French forces, already weakened by disease and guerrilla attacks, found themselves facing enemies who preferred death to capture and who gave no quarter to opponents. The systematic massacres that characterized this final phase of the conflict reflected the complete breakdown of the racial compromises that had characterized earlier periods of the revolution. Yellow fever continued its relentless work among French ranks, claiming lives with the same efficiency that had destroyed previous European expeditions. General Leclerc himself succumbed to the disease in November 1802, dying in the same tropical climate that had killed thousands of his subordinates. His replacement, General Rochambeau, responded to mounting casualties with even greater brutality, importing attack dogs from Cuba to terrorize the black population and implementing mass drownings that shocked even hardened colonial observers. These escalating atrocities only strengthened black resistance while demonstrating the moral bankruptcy of French colonial policy. European observers began questioning whether any economic advantage could justify the human costs of maintaining slavery through such extreme violence. The revolution that had begun as a local uprising against plantation conditions had evolved into a fundamental challenge to the entire system of Atlantic slavery. In his alpine cell, Toussaint remained unaware of these developments, but his body was failing under the accumulated stress of imprisonment. Chronic respiratory infections, exacerbated by the damp cold of his dungeon, left him gasping for breath during simple activities like walking across his tiny cell. The robust constitution that had sustained him through decades of tropical warfare proved no match for the calculated cruelty of French imprisonment. French medical officers who examined him noted with clinical precision the progression of his decline. Weight loss, persistent cough, signs of scurvy from dietary deficiencies, all carefully documented as evidence of natural deterioration rather than deliberate mistreatment. These reports would later serve to absolve Napoleon of direct responsibility for Toussaint's death, presenting it as the unfortunate but inevitable result of age and confinement rather than systematic murder. The psychological pressure intensified as Toussaint began experiencing vivid hallucinations brought on by malnutrition and sensory deprivation. Conversations with long-dead comrades, visions of burning plantations, phantom sounds of drums and revolutionary songs, all blended together in a mental landscape where past and present became indistinguishable. Guards noted his habit of speaking to invisible companions, further evidence of the mental deterioration that isolation was designed to produce. Yet even as his body wasted away and his mind struggled against the effects of prolonged imprisonment, Toussaint never lost sight of the larger significance of his situation. In letters that would never be delivered, he continued to articulate his vision of human equality and natural rights. These final writings, discovered only after his death, revealed a man who maintained his intellectual clarity even as physical deterioration accelerated. The end came with characteristic French efficiency on April 7th, 1803. A guard entering with the daily ration of bread found Toussaint's body seated rigidly in his chair, eyes open but lifeless, staring at the stone wall that had confined him for nearly a year. The official cause of death was recorded as pneumonia, a diagnosis that conveniently obscured the systematic neglect that had made such an outcome inevitable. News of Toussaint's death was carefully managed by French authorities who understood its potential impact on colonial stability. Official announcements emphasized his peaceful end as evidence of French magnanimity toward even the most dangerous rebels. The implication was clear. Resistance to imperial authority might be forgiven, but it could never be allowed to succeed permanently. But Napoleon's calculation that eliminating Toussaint would end the threat to French colonial authority proved to be one of the most catastrophic miscalculations of his career. Far from dampening revolutionary fervor, news of their leader's death in a French dungeon convinced black forces in Saint-Domingue that compromise with European powers was impossible. The man who had counseled moderation and diplomatic solutions was gone, leaving behind followers who embraced strategies of total warfare that would ultimately prove unstoppable. The final irony of Toussaint's imprisonment was that his death accomplished exactly what his life had threatened to achieve: the complete destruction of European colonial authority in Saint-Domingue. By martyring the one leader who might have negotiated a peaceful transition to independence, Napoleon ensured that the revolution would conclude with the total expulsion of French power and the establishment of Haiti as the first black republic in human history. The fortress of Joux stands silent now, its stone walls no longer containing the man who shook empires and redefined what was possible in human history. But Toussaint Louverture's death in that frozen alpine cell was not the end of his story. It was the beginning of his ultimate triumph. Within months of his martyrdom, Jean-Jacques Dessalines would proclaim the independence of Haiti, creating the first black republic on earth through the very violence that Toussaint had tried to avoid. The man who died alone in chains had achieved something Napoleon, with all his armies and ambitions, never could. He had proven that the human desire for freedom was stronger than any empire. Napoleon's attempt to erase Toussaint from history backfired spectacularly. The Louisiana Purchase, forced upon the French emperor by his Caribbean defeat, doubled the size of the United States and changed the course of American expansion forever. The Haitian Revolution sent shockwaves through every slaveholding society in the Americas, inspiring generations of freedom fighters who understood that liberation was not just a dream, but an achievable reality. Every chain broken, every plantation burned, every enslaved person who tasted freedom owed a debt to the coachman who became a general, who became a statesman, who became legend. This is why they buried his story in forgotten archives and relegated his achievements to footnotes in European histories. Because acknowledging Toussaint Louverture means acknowledging that greatness has no color, that genius recognizes no master, and that the most profound revolutions begin not in palaces, but in the hearts of those who refuse to accept that their humanity is negotiable. The slave who built an empire and destroyed Napoleon proved that freedom, once truly understood, becomes an unstoppable force that no dungeon can contain and no emperor can defeat.